There are a handful of texts that form the great books of the American high school experience. You have The Scarlet Letter, The Great Gatsby, and almost inevitably, you have that one terrifying sermon from the Puritan era that is designed to shock you. Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Even if you haven't read it, you know its imagery. It's the ultimate fire and brimstone rant. It's the source of that horrifying metaphor. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. This sermon, delivered by a New England preacher named Jonathan Edwards in 1741, has come to define our entire popular understanding of Puritanism. We read it, we recoil, and we form a clear picture of its author. Jonathan Edwards must have been a terrifying, wild-eyed fanatic, a medieval monster of a man, a religious zealot who hated humanity and used base, psychological terror to bully people into his pews. But what if I told you that this caricature is almost entirely wrong? What if I told you that Jonathan Edwards was not a backward-looking fanatic, but arguably the single greatest and most sophisticated philosopher and intellectual America has ever produced? What if I told you he was a man of the Enlightenment, a scientific observer who wrote detailed papers on spiders and physics, a student of Isaac Newton, and a devotee of the philosopher John Locke? And what if I told you that Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God is not, at its heart, a simple scare tactic? What if it's actually a brilliant, deeply complex, and ruthlessly logical philosophical argument about the nature of reality, determinism, and the human will, an argument so profound and so terrifying that it had to be dressed in the language of horror? Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, the philosopher behind the fear. The man versus the caricature. The man we meet in the high school anthology is a one-dimensional monster. The real man was a once-in-a-generation genius. Jonathan Edwards was not a product of a dark medieval past. He was a man of the 18th century Enlightenment. The child prodigy, he was a true prodigy. By age 11, he had written a sophisticated scientific essay on the flying spider, based on his own meticulous first-hand observations of how spiders used silk to balloon and travel on the wind. Image Edwards's essay on spiders. It's a work of empirical, natural science. The scholar, he entered Yale College at the age of 13. He graduated valedictorian. He read the great thinkers of his day, not just the Bible. His mind was shaped by Isaac Newton's vision of a universe governed by fixed, perfect laws, and by John Locke's new philosophy of the mind. The philosopher, before he was 30, he had filled notebooks with profound philosophical and metaphysical speculations. Works like Notes on the Mind that are still studied by philosophers today. He would later become the president of Princeton University. This is not the man we picture. We picture a wild-eyed screaming ranter, but eyewitness accounts of the Sinner's sermon describe the exact opposite. Edwards did not shout. He read the entire, dense, 45-minute sermon in a quiet, level, monotonous voice, never once lifting his eyes from the manuscript in his hand. So why did this quiet, brilliant, philosophical sermon cause such an explosion? Why did it, according to reports, cause people in the congregation to literally shriek in terror, to cry out, "What must I do to be saved?" and to grab onto the pews to keep from sliding into hell? To understand that, we have to understand the time in which he lived, and the philosophical argument he was really making. The context, the First Great Awakening. Edwards was not preaching in a vacuum. He was a central figure in a massive, transatlantic religious revival known as the First Great Awakening. Image: George Whitefield, preaching, painting. This was a time of intense religious fervor, but it was also a crisis. The old, dry, intellectual Puritanism of the past was losing its grip. The new generation was more secular, more rational. Edwards, and other revivalists like George Whitefield, were faced with a problem. How do you make the old, abstract doctrines of Calvinism, doctrines like original sin, divine sovereignty, and predestination, feel real and urgent to a new, modern, Enlightenment or audience? This is where Edwards's study of John Locke becomes crucial. Locke's philosophy argued that all our ideas come from sensation. We only know what our five senses tell us. You can't just tell someone an abstract idea. You have to make them feel it. You have to create an idea of sensation in their mind. This became Edwards's entire preaching strategy. He believed that the problem with his congregation was not that they didn't believe in sin and hell in an abstract intellectual way. The problem was that they didn't feel the reality of it in their hearts. They could assent to the idea of hell, but it didn't change how they lived. Sinners in the hands of an angry God was not a rant. It was a calculated, philosophical experiment. It was an attempt by a Lockean philosopher to take the abstract, theological doctrine of damnation and make it so vivid, so visceral, so terrifying, that his listeners would, for the first time, truly experience it through their senses. He wasn't just trying to inform their minds, he was trying to hijack their imaginations. He uses a relentless barrage of sensory images. The sight of the fiery pit and glowing flames, the sound of the dreadful, doleful cries of the damned, the feeling of the weight of sin pulling you down, the slipperiness of the ground under your feet, and, most famously, the tactile sensation of being a loathsome insect held over a fire. This was a masterful use of Enlightenment psychology. He was a philosopher, using his tools to create a religious experience. But what, exactly, was the argument he was trying to make? The philosophical argument, it's not just, you're bad, you go to hell. The popular reading of the sermon is simple. Do bad things, and God will get angry and send you to hell. This is completely wrong. Edwards's real argument, based on his strict Calvinist and determinist philosophy, is far more terrifying. Step 1. The premise total depravity and determinism. Edwards begins with a core belief. Original sin is real. Because of Adam's fall, human nature itself is not good or even neutral. It is fundamentally, deeply, and helplessly corrupted. Our wills are not free in the way we think they are. Our wills are in bondage to sin. We are naturally inclined towards evil and away from God. Step 2. The logical consequence. You deserve hell. Now, if your will is naturally inclined only towards sin, and God is perfectly holy and just, then the only thing you justly deserve, at every single moment, is God's righteous judgment, hell. This is the core of the sermon. Edwards's point is not that you might go to hell if you sin. His point is that you should already be in hell right now. He argues that the only reason you are not currently in hell is not because you are a good person, not because you go to church, not because you are healthy, but for one reason, and one reason only. Step 3. The terrifying conclusion. The hand of God, the only reason you are still alive, still breathing, still sitting in that pew, and not in the pit, is because of the arbitrary sheer will of God, who is actively, sovereignly, and miraculously holding you up. This is the real meaning of the spider metaphor. You hang by a slender thread, with the flames of divine wrath flashing about it. You have no interest in any mediator. You have nothing to lay hold of to save yourself, nothing to take off the flames of wrath. In short, you have nothing of your own to keep you from falling. The sermon is not a threat. It is a statement of reality as Edwards saw it. You are, by your own corrupted nature, destined to fall. The only thing preventing your fall is God's sovereign hand, which holds you. And, Edwards argues, that hand is getting tired. God is dreadfully provoked by your continued rebellion, and his justice demands that he let you go. His angry nature is not a capricious mood. It is the rational, just response of a holy being to unholy. The terror of the sermon, then, is the terror of absolute dependence. It's the horrifying realization that you have zero control over your own ultimate fate. You are a spider held by a hand, and that hand, bound by its own perfect justice, is beginning to loosen its grip. The aftermath, and the real Edwards. This sermon, preached in Enfield, Connecticut, in 1741, had its intended effect. The congregation was, by all accounts, overwhelmed. People cried out, they moaned, they grabbed the pillars of the church, as if they could literally feel themselves sliding into the pit. The revival, the Great Awakening, was in full swing. But this one sermon, which was uncharacteristic in its relentless focus on terror, came to define Edwards for all of history. We forgot the rest of him. We forgot the philosopher of beauty. The real Edwards, the one you find in his private writings, was not a man obsessed with hellfire. He was a mystic, obsessed with the beauty of God. His central theological work, The End for Which God Created the World, is not about wrath. It's about God's disposition to diffuse his own fullness, that is, his beauty and joy to his creation. We also forgot the pastor who was so principled that he was fired by his own church. Years later, his congregation in Northampton, Massachusetts, voted him out not because he was too scary, but because he was too strict. He refused to serve communion to people he believed were not truly, demonstrably saved, a decision that destroyed his popular support. This is not the action of a man who just wanted to scare people into the pews. This was a man who, for better or worse, was absolutely, uncompromisingly committed to his own theological and philosophical principles. He ended his life as a missionary to Native Americans and, briefly, as the president of what is now Princeton University, where he died from a smallpox inoculation. His true legacy is not one sermon, but a library of dense, brilliant philosophical works, like Freedom of the Will and The Nature of True Virtue, which are foundational to American thought. Conclusion: the final debate, fanatic or philosopher. So, we are left with two completely different portraits of Jonathan Edwards. There is the high school caricature, the hellfire and brimstone fanatic, the medieval boogeyman, the angry Puritan who used cheap scare tactics to terrorize his congregation. And then there is the historical reality, the scientific prodigy, the brilliant Enlightenment philosopher, the profound mystic of beauty, and the uncompromising idealist. The sermon Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God is the violent collision point between these two identities. It is the moment when the philosopher took his most extreme, logical to him conclusions about human depravity and divine sovereignty, and translated them, using the psychological tools of John Locke, into the most visceral, terrifying sensory language imaginable. And this brings us to the final, crucial debate. How should we read this text? Is the popular high school caricature essentially correct? Was this sermon, regardless of the philosophy behind it, ultimately an act of psychological terrorism, a dangerous, fear-based manipulation that has caused generations of religious trauma and given faith a bad name? Or is that reading too simplistic? Was Edwards, in fact, a misunderstood intellectual? A man so brilliant and so logical that he simply followed his philosophical premises, total depravity, divine sovereignty, to their terrifying, but inescapable, conclusion. Are we repulsed by the sermon, not because it's wrong, but because it's a profoundly uncomfortable logical argument about the human condition and our ultimate dependence on a power beyond our control, a truth we simply don't want to hear? What do you think? Was Jonathan Edwards a fanatic? Or was he a philosopher who was simply too logical for his own good? Let me know your thoughts, respectfully, in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into the mind behind the most famous sermon in American history fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content that uncovers the hidden stories behind our beliefs and practices. Thanks for watching.